We'll get started. We've got, this is our 10th conference of the National Parents Council Education Conference, so it's a bit of a milestone for us. So what we've tried to do this time is look at the whole link between home and school. Now, we have spent many years bringing in researchers from different parts of the world. People might have seen the researchers we've brought in from America, from Canada, from Holland, from Scotland, but we're really delighted today to actually say that we've got some Irish-based research. And we've been working with Marino College and also the NCCA, which is the National Council for Curriculum and Assessment, in developing the research that you're going to hear about today. And also, I think quite aptly, the first people who are ever going to hear about the research is you as parents, which I think is really important. It is the first time. The research is still hot off the press, I think. I think it was being completed this week in terms of writing it up. So we're really pleased to welcome LEAH O TOOLE and Joan Kiley from Marino to present on the research to you today. And I'll hand you over.
Thanks very much. Thanks, Anya. Okay, so I just want to begin by introducing the research team. So this morning you'll hear from myself and Joan, but we're part of a much bigger research team that's been working on this piece of research. So first of all, Dr. Joan Kiley is here beside me, but we also have Emma Zara O'Brien here, Dr. Maya Hals-Brosnan, and our colleague Cleena O'Keefe as well. We worked very hard on this research together, so I just wanted to make sure to acknowledge our colleagues' work on it also, and they'll be available to answer some questions as well later on. So a little bit of background to the research. It was funded by the National Council for Curriculum and Assessment, and a competitive tender was put out by the National Parents Council. And when we saw the tender as a team, we were really, really excited about this. So we want to begin by really thanking Anya and the National Parents Council for the opportunity to do this research. Certainly for Joan and I, our PhDs were based on very similar research. So as I say, when we saw the tender, we thought, absolutely, this is something we have to bid for. So we were so excited when we were successful on it. In terms of today's presentation, what we'll do is we'll introduce you to the research, give you a little bit of background on it, but when Anya says we've just finished writing up the research, the final report ran to about 450 pages, isn't that right, Joan? It's about that thick, so apologies to Anya, that's some hours you're never getting back, having had to trawl through all of that. So within an hour, there was no way we could kind of give you the entire picture of the research. So we've chosen what we thought were maybe the key pieces of information that we thought you might be interested in. So I'll take you through the idea of the home learning environment and the importance of the environments we as parents create for children to support their learning, the key role that relationships between home and school play in children's learning, and then Joan will talk to you about the very contested role of homework, the big bad homework, and she'll talk to you also about our findings and our recommendations for parental involvement going forward. So that's the plan for today. So the research itself, it had 3 parts, and the first part was a literature review. So that's looking at all of the literature that has taken place, or all the kind of the research and the writing that's happened elsewhere about parental involvement in their children's education. So this is the document itself, and that's available on the National Parents Council website for anybody who's interested in seeing it. That was part 1. Part 2 then involved case studies in 5 schools across Ireland. And when we were identifying these schools, we wanted to get a kind of a broad spectrum of experience. So the schools we chose were schools where we had identified through our existing networks schools that really were engaged in quite positive practice in engaging with parents. But at the same time, we started off early on in identifying that it wasn't just the good practice we were interested in. We wanted, I suppose, a warts and all view that parents had to be free to kind of explore any difficulties they might have had, and the same for teachers and children. We were interested in kind of triangulating the experiences of the parents, the teachers, the children, other interested parties. So there was a school that was in a suburb of a large city in Ireland. There were many families in that school that were experiencing poverty. The area in question had a lot of social difficulties. It's what we call DESH Band 1. So some of you might be aware there's a system in some schools that called DESH, where there are additional supports provided to schools with a view to kind of trying to counteract social and economic difficulties. So that was our first school. The second school then was in a large provincial town in Ireland. There was a very diverse population of families, lots of kind of linguistic diversity, lots of social diversity, ethnic diversity, and it was an Educate Together school. The third one then was a small rural school. There was quite an affluent demographic, mostly Indigenous Irish, Catholic patronage. Then our fourth school was an interesting perspective because the children there had special educational needs. So we found that for the parents involved, that led to a very specific kind of engagement with the school. Do you know, that their children's needs meant that they had to be a lot more involved with the school on a day-to-day basis. So that gave a particular insight there. And then finally, the fifth school was a Gael school in quite an affluent suburb of a large city in Ireland. So that gave us quite an interesting perspective, the different contexts that we explored within the case studies. So that was part 2 of our research. Moving on then, part 3, the research were language workshops, and Joan will give you a much more in detail view of what happened within part 3. But briefly, this was where we worked with the schools in question to help the teachers and parents work together to create new approaches to homework to develop the learning goals of the primary language curriculum. So I'll pause on that one because Joan will give you a lot more detail on it. So that was the research in general there. So why did we go about this research? Well, kind of setting the scene. In the past, we tended to think of children's education as something that happened solely in school, whereas in recent years, we've started to realise that learning, of course, is far more embedded within the families, within the communities, within the societies in which it takes place. So children obviously learn within their families, and we've started to recognise that of course, parents are the primary educators of children. So teachers, educators, policymakers, researchers like ourselves, we've become more and more interested in that link between home and school and how we can support parents to support the learning of their children, how we can support teachers to link well with parents, all of course with a view to supporting children's learning. But as we've drilled into that over the years, it started to become more and more complex, because the questions has started to emerge as to what we actually mean by parental involvement. You know, on the one hand, it could mean something as simple as getting the child up in the morning, getting him or her dressed and to the school gate on time. Equally, it could be something as involved as sitting on a school board of management, and there are so many gradations in between. So, for example, in some schools, parents come into classrooms and engage in activities like maths for fun or science for fun. They engage in station teaching, for example. Sometimes parents are involved in parents' associations. Equally, in recent literature, there's been a focus on what happens outside of school to support children's learning. Sometimes parents never cross the school walls, and yet the activities they engage in are very educational. So we've started to realise it's not as simple as joining the Parents' Association, for example. There are educational activities that parents engage in that are very important, that may not be kind of recognised as parental involvement as such. So this is where we come to the idea of the home learning environment. And this is a phrase that's increasingly being used when we start to think about parental involvement. And the kinds of things that we recognised in part one of the research from the literature review were things like when parents have very positive attitudes to learning and high expectations of their children, that's very useful. When parents provide access to books, or when children have a membership of a library, that's really helpful for their education. When children have access to some technologies like computers and the internet, that supports their education. But when there's a limitation to access to other technologies like phones, game consoles, televisions in bedrooms, again, that supports education. Clear behavioural limits so that children are facilitated to go into school settings and they know how to self-regulate. These are the kinds of things that we're finding. A newly emerging term is the idea of stage setting, which is really interesting, like the theatre metaphor that when, the traditional idea of parental involvement was almost that the parent was on the stage with them, whereas now there's the idea of the parent in the background preparing the child to go on stage themselves. I hope this is making sense. And the idea that the parent in the background is providing the child with the skills and dispositions to go to school and succeed. So these are the idea of the home learning environment. But I think it's really, really important to realise that this idea of a home learning environment is hugely culturally loaded. So I'm a parent of 3 children myself, and I think the idea of somebody coming and telling me whether I have a good home, it's quite interesting. It brings up the defensiveness, doesn't it, as a parent sometimes? And Liz Brooker is an interesting writer. She talks about an example of, in the UK, they have tick boxes about things like whether there are books in the home. And she gives an example of a family where it said no books, so tick, not a good home learning environment. But on qualitative review, there was loads of sacred scripts, for example. There were magazines. There was lots of literacy materials. So there was lots of opportunity for access to literacy. Or another home where tick, lots of books in the home, but the family told her, but of course she won't be allowed to touch the books until she's able to read, because I don't want her to ruin them. They're lovely books, So we have to be careful about these ideas. We need to keep that in mind. So within our research, our case studies in particular, we looked at parents' views on their roles as educators within the home learning environment and the kinds of home learning environments they tried to create for their own children. So one very interesting finding that we identified, this was one that really struck us, was where parental confidence came in. So that when we asked, for example, the parents from kind of less socially and economically advantaged schools about how involved they were in their children's education, they initially told us, no, I'm not that involved at all, I just bring them to school. And when we asked the more socially and economically advantaged parents, they said, oh, I'm very, very involved. But when we drilled down into it and asked them about the kinds of activities they did, it turned out they were actually doing pretty much the same thing. It was just about the confidence to identify that as educational. Okay, so the kinds of things they were doing were teaching children to use money or read the clock, so building their mathematical skills, teaching them manners and appropriate ways of interacting with others, teaching them social skills. They were getting out into natural environments, parks, forests, seasides, playing sports, so their physical skills, their motor skills, their health and well-being. They were playing together. So Joan and I, when we were preparing this presentation, we were thinking about an interview that Joan did with one family, and they were talking about doing, the TV show, what's it called again, Joan? America's Got Talent, and how they were setting up as a family and they were judging each other, doing this, 10 out of 10 or 6 out of 10, and then they'd perform their show, and these games that they play together. Building language skills and oral language skills, talking and ongoing conversation, and how they build language skills like this. And in the more kind of socially, economically advantaged home and in the less advantaged home, they focused on their interest in school, giving that kind of encouragement to children to do well at school. And yet, you know, they were doing the same things and maybe just not having the confidence to recognise that in themselves as supporting their children's education. So we thought that was quite interesting. So again, as a result of that lack of confidence, we found that the less advantaged parents tended to want the school to do more for their child directly, rather than wanting to be involved in that education themselves. There was a difference in the kinds of screen time that was allowed. The more advantaged parents were more likely to read with their children and limit screen time. So that was an interesting one. What else? We found that money allows for access to things like holidays abroad, trips to museums, hiking trips, and a variety of cultural activities. But for the more advantaged parents, time was a big barrier to creating the kinds of home learning environments that they really wanted to. You know, that was a real juggle for parents trying to manage the time constraints that they had to spend time with their children and play with them. And interestingly, those that would have traditionally been seen as maybe marginalised or disadvantaged were benefiting from more unstructured free play that some in the literature would argue is very beneficial for development. So, you know, it's an interesting dichotomy there, or an interesting thing to consider. So that's home learning environment. That was one of the interesting areas we explored. The other kind of key thing to emerge from our research was the idea of relationships. So traditionally in education, the three R's were reading, writing, and arithmetic. And for us, the three R's are relationships, relationships, relationships. They were what came out as most important across the research. So the first thing in building relationships, we would say, is that when schools want to engage with parents, they really need to recognise that parents are not all the same as each other. You know, as families, we all have different needs. So some of the parents in our cohort maybe had difficult experiences of schools themselves. They were intimidated by schools, they were fearful of schools, and they really needed proactive invitations from teachers to have the confidence to cross that school boundary and make contact with the school. And they really needed that proactive invitation. But the problem was that there was another cohort of parents who were exceptionally busy, juggling maybe working lives, other caring responsibilities. The juggle is very real for a lot of parents. So if they got bombarded with invitations, they experienced that as intense pressure. So for schools, it's really tough to get it right. And what we found was that really what schools and teachers needed to do was focus on the relationship first. You know, get that relationship right so that they could be attuned to the individual needs of parents, and that they could understand who were the parents that needed the repeated supportive, proactive invitations, and who were the parents that maybe needed just to be left alone for the moment. You know, the attunement, like with the education with small children, really, that idea of individual need and attunement. We put this kind of quote here because we thought that it really is the crucial idea that in exploring the strategies that work in parental involvement, it's not actually the strategies that work. You know, the schools had lots of different ideas about how to make parental involvement work, but it wasn't the strategies themselves that mattered. It was actually the ethos, the relationship, the feel of the school. There were some schools, the minute you walked in the door, you could feel something special, and sometimes you couldn't really put your finger on what it was, but there was something relational there that worked, you know? So it's really the basic human relationships, one human being to another. That's actually what works for parental involvement. So really what's required are a variety of modes of communication, awareness of and support for cultural and linguistic diversity, understanding parents' own educational experiences as a mediating factor. And that goes back again to the home learning environment. So a lot of the literature talks about parents giving positive attitudes towards schools as important for children's learning. But for example, there's a lot of evidence in Ireland of Irish travellers being actively mistreated in the Irish setting, in educational settings, historically, I will say. So it's a little bit rich to expect those parents then to give a positive attitude to their children, do you know? So we need to be thinking about parents' own educational experiences and kind of supporting them to understand that primary schools are different now. That's not maybe the experience your child is going to have. So that kind of relationship building is important. The role of school leadership in that relationship building emerged as absolutely key. So the principal's attitude and leadership as absolutely crucial, setting the tone, the openness, the approachability, the trust, the sense of value for parents' contributions and how that filtered down then. I mean, I can think of the school in question that I know best and the principal in question who would be out every morning directing traffic, but he wasn't really directing traffic, if you know what I mean. He was out, you know, meeting people and saying, how was your holiday, and love the new hairstyle, and do you know those, because once you have those informal conversations, then when you have to have the big conversations, it's much easier. It's relationship building. The thorny issue of boundaries was something that really emerged strongly in this research, and we don't think it's really been documented. You know, it's something that kind of anecdotally, it's what people talk about all the time, and yet it hasn't really been documented in research to the extent that people talk about it. So there were people who talked about, you know, if parents are in and out of the school all the time, how do we know the children are protected? Things about power structures, you know, lack of clarity maybe on who should or shouldn't be allowed to do what. Differences between teachers' attitudes, you know, in schools where there was a lot of parental involvement, some teachers feeling a little bit unsure about that, whereas other teachers were delighted with it, you know. Some parents even feeling unsure about it when other parents were very, very happy with it. But what we found worked, again, was the relational approach. So where boundary setting was really successful, it was, again, this relational aim that we need boundaries in order to ensure that when a teacher is engaged with the parents, they are free to pay them their full attention. Do you know? So as a teacher, if I'm speaking to a parent, I need to be able to focus on that parent while I'm speaking to him or her, rather than being distracted with lots of other things at the time. So that's what boundaries are for, do you know, rather than distancing families and communities. Another interesting relational piece, do it okay, yeah. Doing okay, time-wise, okay. Another interesting relational piece that, again, we think is new, that hasn't really been documented, was the relationships between parents. That was really, really important in this research to the parents we spoke to. So this key role for parental involvement in supporting potentially isolated parents to make friends. So if you're new to a community, that opportunity at the school gate to meet other parents and to make friends. But we saw a real split between the parents who had the time and capacity to be very involved with schools and those who didn't. And it was interesting because there was a lot of distress caused by it, you know. And in previous literature, it has been that kind of sense of kind of deficit models had been documented in terms of teachers' attitudes. So the kind of, you know, parents who maybe felt intimidated by teachers and therefore didn't get involved in their children's education. But we haven't come across this dynamic at all with other parents, where parents were saying to us, you know, oh, the people who are involved in the school a lot, you know, they kind of look down on us because I just don't have time to do an awful lot, so I keep my distance, do you know? So it was interesting. It was an interesting dynamic to see. As a working parent, I can relate, to be honest. It's, yeah, but it made some parents even less likely to be involved. So that's the kind of key issues around home learning environment and relationships. So I'll ask Joan to take the floor now and talk to you about homework.
Okay.